Just after 5 p.m. on Halloween 1957, in a Los Angeles suburb called Sun Valley, 35-year-old Peter Fabiano turned off the lights at his beauty salon, flipped the sign in his shop window from open to closed, and got into his car to begin the short drive home. Peter turned onto a long residential street and pulled into the driveway of a corner house at the end of the block. Peter put the car in park and just sat for a moment. As he stared at the Halloween decorations his wife had hung on the windows, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He couldn't believe this was his house. And to him, his house was sort of a symbol of how dramatically his life had recently changed. Just a few short years earlier, Peter had felt completely lost. He was living by himself and struggling to make ends meet, and that's when he got mixed up with some bad people who said he could make some money working for them. Even though Peter had agreed to do this, he had known it was not a smart decision, and he was quickly proven right when he ran into trouble with the law. Peter ultimately avoided doing jail time, but this had been a wake-up call for him. After that, he had worked hard to clean up his act and to really start planning for his future. And his hard work eventually paid off. Now he was married and ran a successful business, and he owned a brand new home that had literally just been built. In short, Peter Fabiano was living the American dream. And on top of that, he was enjoying the kind of personal freedom that he had personally fought for on the front lines during World War II. Life was good. Peter strolled up his front walkway between the rows of carved Halloween pumpkins and stepped inside his house. His wife Betty walked up to him, carrying a large bucket full of candy, and as she placed the candy on a table near the door, Peter gave his wife a peck on the cheek. Betty smiled and then quickly turned and walked away. And Peter wondered if maybe Betty's smile was forced, and if maybe she was mad about something. As happy as Peter was about his job and his new house in the suburbs, he and Betty's marriage had its share of difficulties. In fact, just that summer, a few months earlier, things had gotten so tense between them that Betty had moved out for a while. But she had come back, and things had really seemed like they were getting better between them. And so Peter decided to ask a simple question just to gauge Betty's mood. He said, "Hey, have any trick-or-treaters come by yet?" And to Peter's relief, Betty laughed and told him it was still too early. All the trick-or-treaters were probably still eating dinner. Peter relaxed, convinced he'd been reading way too much into his wife's smile, and he started to get excited about handing out candy to a parade of children in funny costumes. In the 1950s in the United States, the act of trick-or-treating had really started to become a popular Halloween tradition for children, and the holiday itself was growing into the huge part of American pop culture that it is today. When Peter was a kid, he didn't get to go trick-or-treating. It wasn't really a thing back then. But now, even though he was an adult, he was quite happy to be a part of it, even if his role was just handing out candy. Peter's teenage stepdaughter, Judy, came bounding out of her room in full costume, dressed as Alice from Alice in Wonderland. She said she was heading out to a Halloween party, and she had a ride there, but she would need a ride home. Peter said no problem, he'd come pick her up, but no later than 10 p.m. because it was a school night. Judy huffed and said fine before telling him where she'd be and walking out the door. By 6 o'clock, shortly after Judy had left for her party, the sun was setting and the Fabiano's doorbell rang for the first time that night. Peter and Betty heard a chorus of young voices chanting "Trick or treat" from right outside the door. Betty smiled, put on her pointy black witch's hat, grabbed the bucket of candy by its handles, and opened up the door. In front of her stood a little boy in a robot costume, and on either side of him were what Betty assumed were his two big sisters, both dressed as fairies. Betty reached into her bucket and grabbed as much candy as her hand could fit, and then dropped the candy into each of the kids' bags. The kids thanked her and ran off. At this point, Peter walked up behind Betty to look outside, and he saw more children approaching. It looked like it was going to be a busy night. A little before 11 p.m. that night, after the last of the trick-or-treaters had come by the house, and Peter had picked up his stepdaughter Judy from her Halloween party, Peter walked into his bedroom and saw Betty reading in bed. He slipped into his pajamas and yawned. He thought about how he and Betty would have to be up at the crack of dawn tomorrow to get Judy to school, and also then to open the two salons they ran for a full day of appointments. And so all Peter wanted to do was just collapse and go to sleep. And so Peter slid into bed with Betty, but then put her book down on the nightstand and she turned off the lamp. As the couple lay in bed, Peter remarked to Betty that this time of the year was exhausting. Betty agreed. Decorating, hosting, entertaining, these things were hard work. She said now that Halloween was over, they would have to start sending invitations for Thanksgiving. And then as soon as Thanksgiving was over, they wouldn't even have time to breathe before they'd have to start decorating for Christmas and planning their big Christmas party. Peter joked that maybe next year they should just board up their house for the holidays and take an extended vacation. Betty started to laugh, but before she could say anything else, their doorbell rang. Peter sat up, switched on the lamp, and looked at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. He turned to Betty and said it seemed really strange that somebody would ring their doorbell so late. Betty thought it might just be a late trick-or-treater, even though more than 2 hours had passed since the last trick-or-treater had come by. Peter pushed himself out of bed. Maybe it was one of the earlier visitors coming back for seconds, he said. If so, it was their lucky night, because they still had more than enough candy to last through the new year. Peter put on his robe, stepped into his slippers, and began walking towards the front door. And as he did, the doorbell rang again. And this time, Peter heard "trick or treat" from a voice calling out from the other side of the door. And so Peter picked up the bucket of candy on the side table, reached for the doorknob, and pulled the front door open. A few minutes later, Sun Valley police officer Bud Alper was fast asleep in his bed, 2 doors down from Peter and Betty's house, when suddenly this violent pounding noise jolted him awake. The pounding persisted as Alper slowly gained his bearings, and he realized that somebody was banging on the front door of his house. Alper picked up his watch from the nightstand and looked at the time, and when he saw how late it was, he instinctively began reaching for his service revolver. He had no idea what was going on, but someone banging on his door this late definitely couldn't be something good. But just then, he heard the sound of a young woman's voice, tearfully calling his name, pleading with him to open the door. Alper opened his front door, and through bleary eyes, he saw his teenage neighbor, Judy, the daughter of Betty Fabiano, standing there in her nightgown with tears streaming down her cheeks. Judy begged Alper to help her. Her stepfather had been shot, she said. He was lying on the floor of their house, dying. Alper ran out of the house and followed Judy to her front door and stopped just outside the doorway. Alper saw Peter lying motionless on the floor, partially blocking the entrance to the house. Alper quickly stepped over him and darted inside the house, and he saw Betty, Peter's wife, standing frozen in the hallway with her hand over her mouth, looking like she was in shock. Alper asked where their phone was, and Judy pointed towards the kitchen. Five minutes later, an ambulance pulled up at the Fabiano's house, and paramedics picked Peter up, put him on a stretcher, and sped away to the hospital. Officer Bill Lehman of the Sun Valley Police Department parked his cruiser at the Fabiano house just as the ambulance left, and he walked up to the front door. Lehman greeted his fellow officer, Bud Alper, who was standing on the walkway in his pajama robe and lighting a cigarette. Standing near her was Mrs. Fabiano, who was sobbing, and when Officer Lehman approached her, she began to recount what had happened. Betty said that shortly after she and her husband had gone to bed, their doorbell had rang, and they both assumed it was just a late trick-or-treater. Betty said she had stayed in bed while Peter had gone to the door. From bed, Betty had heard her husband open the front door and say, "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" She then heard someone with a strange voice reply, "No," and a few seconds later, Betty heard a loud pop, followed by a thud. As Betty got out of bed and began running to the front of the house, she heard tires screeching and a car speeding away, and there, at the foot of the front door, she found her husband lying on the rug, bleeding from a wound in his chest. Betty told the officer that, based on the tone of her husband's voice after he opened the door, she was pretty sure that whoever he was talking to at the door was an adult, and she could almost swear that the voice she heard in response to him sounded like a man impersonating a woman. Lehman furrowed his eyebrows as he jotted down this strange detail in his notepad. Was the person at the door using a fake voice, because Peter would have recognized them otherwise? And if this was the case, did it mean they were also wearing some sort of costume? It was Halloween after all. Lehman walked back to his cruiser, reached inside of it, and then returned to the front door with a small box. He placed the box over the doorbell and secured it there with some tape. That way nobody could touch it before crime scene investigators showed up to dust for prints. Officer Lehman turned to Betty and asked if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Peter or wanted Peter dead. Betty hesitated just for a second and then shook her head. She said she couldn't think of anybody. A short time later, homicide detective Pat Keeley rolled up to the Fabiano house and took over the investigation. Officer Lehman briefed Detective Keeley on the details of what had happened, and then Keeley approached Betty. He took off his hat, lowered his head a bit, and said he hated to have to tell her this, but her husband Peter never regained consciousness, and he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. Betty immediately broke down and began crying and hugged her daughter. Keeley stepped away to give the victim's grieving family members some space, and as the crime scene investigators showed up to process the scene, Keeley walked across the street to begin his neighborhood canvass. Keeley knocked on the door of the Fabiano's adjacent neighbors and asked if they had seen or heard anything suspicious. The neighbors told the detective that they had heard a loud pop, maybe about 15 minutes earlier, but aside from that, they hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. As the detective scribbled this into his notepad, the neighbor suddenly remembered something he didn't think much of at the time. He said a couple of times that evening, when he would look out the window to see if there were any more trick-or-treaters coming, he noticed a car parked in the street that he'd never seen before. It was an older model, dark-colored sedan, and by his count, it had been parked there for maybe at least an hour, but now it was gone. The neighbor wished he could provide more information, but he didn't take note of the make or model, and he wasn't able to offer a description of anybody in the car. Keeley continued canvassing the neighborhood, but none of the other people on the block saw or heard anything unusual. So he returned to the Fabiano house, hoping that the crime scene investigators had found something useful that might help him close this case quickly. But the news from the other investigators was equally disappointing. There were no fingerprints on the doorbell and no shell casings at the scene. In fact, they hadn't uncovered anything at all, not a single piece of evidence. This crime scene was totally clean. A little later that night, Keeley returned to his desk in the homicide department to begin writing up the report. The 46-year-old veteran took a deep breath and exhaled in a long sigh. He knew he was in for a long night, and he was at an age where he was beginning to wonder if his 95% homicide clearance rate was worth the toll these long nights must be taking on his health. Keeley finished writing up the report and then began looking over what he'd written. He kept thinking how unusual it was that the killers took advantage of Halloween and used trick-or-treating as a ruse. He'd never heard of this happening before, except maybe in a radio play he once listened to. And the crime scene was so spotless. The killers were very careful to not leave anything behind. This suggested a level of planning and organization rarely seen in random killings and robberies. This had all the markings of a professional hit. The day after the murder, Detective Keeley drove down to the Hall of Justice and made his way to the Records Division. He wanted to find out if Peter had any sort of criminal background or maybe a connection to the mob that might have led a professional hitman to show up at his door and kill him. Keeley asked the records clerk for anything he could dig up on a Peter R. Fabiano. The records clerk disappeared into a back room, and a short time later, he returned with a file and handed it to Keeley. And the second Keeley opened that file up and began reading, he knew his instincts had paid off. Peter Fabiano did have a criminal record. About 9 years earlier, Peter had been a bookie, which meant he was setting up gambling bets, taking bet money, and paying out winnings. This was illegal, and Peter had been caught and convicted on a bookmaking charge. He was sentenced to 180 days in jail, but the sentence was ultimately suspended, and he never served any time. Keeley knew that bookies were often associated with organized crime, and he wondered how deep Peter's ties went. Could he have run afoul of a loan shark, or fallen in debt to the wrong people? Something like that would definitely support his professional killer theory. Detective Keeley spent the afternoon probing Peter's business records, his finances, his background, hoping to find other investigations and other shady dealings. Anything that might help Keeley build a list of Peter's potential enemies. But much to Keeley's surprise, aside from that one scrape with the law being a bookie almost a decade earlier, Peter really did seem to have cleaned up his life. He ran a legitimate business, which his wife helped him operate, and none of Peter's friends that Keeley had talked to could think of anyone who had beef with him. However, Keeley had yet to really have a deep conversation with the one person closest to Peter, and that would be Peter's wife and now widow, Betty. That evening, Betty Fabiano sat in a small room inside the Sun Valley police station. After waiting for a few minutes on her own, Detective Keeley walked in, sat down in a chair a few feet away from her, and asked her to take him through the night of Peter's murder again. Betty started recounting everything that had happened that day, starting from when she had finished working at one of the two salons she and Peter owned. Peter, at the time, was working at the other salon. Keeley listened closely, looking for any inconsistencies between this version of events and the story Betty had told him when he had first come to her house. Keeley was not ready to write off the idea that a hired killer had shot Peter, but maybe it wasn't the mob that hired them. Maybe it was the victim's wife. But as Betty spoke, Keeley didn't catch anything that strayed too far from her original story. Still, that didn't necessarily mean anything. Some people were good at memorizing stories. And so Keeley asked Betty to tell him more about her marriage to Peter. Betty explained that she and Peter had been married for about 3 years. She had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and one of those kids, her daughter Judy, lived with them. Keeley asked if she and Peter had any problems in their marriage. Betty paused, then took a deep breath, and admitted that, yes, there had been some marital problems. She said their marriage had become pretty rocky earlier that year, to the point where they actually had separated for a couple of months. Betty had moved out of the house during that time and went to live with a friend. But in July, she and Peter had reconciled, and she had moved back in with him. Betty looked away for a minute and was silent, and then she turned back to Keeley and said there was someone he should know about, someone who might have had it out for Peter. Keeley leaned in and asked her why she hadn't said anything about this person when he talked to her at the house. Betty said she wasn't trying to hide anything. She'd been in total shock at the house, and she hadn't been able to think clearly. But now that she was talking about her and Peter's relationship, it seemed obvious, because she believed this person truly hated Peter, maybe enough to want him dead. It was a woman named Joan Rabel, who used to work part-time for Peter at one of his salons. But Peter had fired Joan because for some reason he just didn't like her. But Betty did. In fact, the 2 women had quickly hit it off when they first met and had become friends. And this really bothered Peter. In fact, it bothered Peter so much that the friendship between Joan and Betty became a source of tension in their marriage, until Peter ultimately forbade his wife to socialize with Joan. Betty felt she had a right to choose her friends and was not going to let her husband control her, but Peter was insistent until Betty felt like he was basically giving her an ultimatum. And ultimately, this is the issue that led Betty and Peter to separate for those several months. However, Betty said after a couple of months of separation, she had a change of heart and returned home to Peter. And he accepted her back, but under the condition that she never see Joan and never even speak Joan's name around him again. As Keeley listened to the story, he found himself puzzled by it. It sounded like there had to be a piece missing somewhere. And so he asked Betty, why did Peter hate Joan so much? But Betty just sort of shrugged and looked away. Keeley couldn't tell if Betty was hiding this information because she knew more about Peter's murder than she was saying, or if she was trying to hide something to protect her dead husband or her friend Joan. Finally, Betty broke the silence and just said that Joan had a really strong personality, and Peter also had a strong personality. And sometimes 2 strong personalities can clash. The next morning, 2 days after Peter's murder, Keeley and his partner decided to pay Joan a surprise visit. They drove to Joan's house in Hollywood, on the other side of the hill, and knocked on her front door. The door swung open and Joan appeared, and as the detectives flashed their badges and said they were there to talk to her about Peter Fabiano, they watched Joan closely to see how she would react, whether she'd be nervous or surprised or something. But Joan just shook her head and looked down. She had already heard the news. How tragic, she said to the investigators. Keeley agreed and said it was tragic, but also her name had come up as a potential suspect, so they needed her to accompany them down to the station and answer some questions. Joan matter-of-factly just said, okay, and asked them to hold on a minute while she got her coat. And as she did that, the investigators shared a look, because honestly, this seemed really strange to them. In almost every homicide case they had ever worked, when somebody was told they were a potential suspect, they got scared or angry or had some kind of strong reaction. Neither of the cops had ever seen someone act so unaffected by this kind of news. They followed Joan inside the house and kept an eye on her while she grabbed her coat and her purse. And she remained totally calm and cooperative when the detectives walked her to their car and drove her back to the valley to police headquarters. As soon as Joan was sitting down inside of the interview room across from Keeley and his partner, she began to talk. Joan insisted that she had nothing to do with Peter's murder. She was not a violent person, she hated guns. In fact, she had never even touched a gun, not once in her whole life. And as Joan continued to talk, Keeley began to notice her calm demeanor slip just a little. She didn't sound angry, she just sounded sort of surprised. She told the detectives she had no idea what they'd heard or who they'd heard it from, but she had no problem whatsoever with Peter Fabiano. She considered both Peter and his wife Betty to be two of her closest friends, and she had only stopped working at the salon because she'd found another job. So, Joan suggested, whoever was pointing the finger at her, the police might want to take a closer look at them. Keeley and his partner exchanged another brief glance. What Joan was saying was a complete contradiction to what Betty had said. Keeley's partner asked Joan if she had an alibi for the night of the murder. She told them she did. She said she had been home all night by herself, but her car had been parked in the front of her house in her driveway, and she was sure one of her neighbors could confirm that. After speaking to Joan for a bit longer, Keeley had his suspicions, but he had no legal reason to hold Joan, so he gave her a ride back to her house. And after Joan went inside and closed the door behind her, Keeley began knocking on her neighbors' doors. And several of them did confirm what Joan told detectives. On the night Peter died, Joan's car never left her driveway. And considering that her house was 12.5 miles away from the Fabiano house, it did seem likely if she was involved somehow in the murder that she would have had to drive there. Keeley returned to the station, went right to his desk, and shook his head in frustration. Less than 2 days into this investigation, and he felt as though the case was already reaching a dead end. Beyond Peter's brief stint as a bookie, nothing had come up that showed he still had ties to organized crime, or that he owed money to anybody. Betty and Joan had told him wildly different stories about Joan's relationship with Peter, so he figured one of them had to be lying. But the lie didn't have to mean they were connected to the murder. The lie could be for some personal reason. And at this point, there was no clear evidence pointing to either of the women. Keeley definitely couldn't rule them out, but he also couldn't really pursue either of them unless some new piece of information surfaced. So Keeley picked up his case file and began scouring the dozen or so pages he'd put together so far, looking for anything he might have missed. But after an hour of studying the facts of the case, he put down the file and felt no closer to an answer. Keeley's nearly perfect homicide clearance rate, which was a great source of professional pride to him, seemed like it was about to take a hit. Nearly a week after the murder, on November 5th, 1957, Peter Fabiano was laid to rest. Following the funeral, Detective Keeley continued to interview Peter's friends and family, but these conversations never seemed to get him anything new. Several more weeks passed, and no matter how many times Keeley looked over his case file, he didn't get any closer to figuring out who had murdered Peter. And with nothing more to go on, and new cases piling up, Detective Keeley and his team turned their attention to other open investigations. The Fabianos' Thanksgiving dinner that year had one fewer face at the table, and while they ate, there was this sense of despair hanging over all of them. Like Keeley, Peter's family started to feel that Peter's case would just never get solved. But on a day not long after Thanksgiving, in early December, the telephone rang at the Sun Valley Police Department. A muffled voice on the other end of the line told the dispatcher they had a tip in the Peter Fabiano case. The caller said that if investigators went to Bullock's department store in downtown Los Angeles and visited the area with the rented storage lockers, they would find a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. This was the gun that was used to kill Peter Fabiano. The caller then provided a locker number and then hung up without giving their name. The dispatcher took down the information and quickly passed it along to Detective Keeley. Keeley was skeptical that this tip would lead anywhere. Whenever a case was all over the news like this one, he usually got at least one call from somebody just looking for attention. Rarely was a vital piece of information just handed to him. It's never that easy. But Keeley was a diligent investigator who followed up on basically every single lead. And so far, the Fabiano case had offered very few. So this was something worth looking into. So Keeley and his partner drove to downtown Los Angeles, entered the Bullock's department store, and had the locker attendant open up the locker the tipster had indicated. And when Keeley looked inside that locker, he couldn't hide his excitement because there inside of it was in fact a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. Keeley asked the locker attendant whose name the locker had been rented under. The attendant opened a registration book, and when she read the name to Keeley, Keeley had never heard of them before. Keeley put the revolver into an evidence bag and drove it back to the station. He knew he would need to figure out where the gun came from, who the gun was registered to, and if the gun had ever been reported stolen. He also knew there was a good chance the locker had been rented under a false name, but he hoped the gun would still lead him to Peter's killer. So he called the state police and gave them the serial number of this gun. And within minutes, Keeley learned that the gun had been purchased on September 21st of that year, the month before the murder, from a gun shop in Pasadena, about 15 miles away. And the buyer of the gun was the very same person who rented the storage locker where the gun was found. This person had not used a fake name to get the gun or the locker. So Keeley could easily track them down, and he was now almost positive this person killed Peter. That evening, after obtaining a warrant, Detective Keeley and his partner arrested the person who had bought the gun and stored it in the locker. The detectives brought this person to the station and sat them down in the interrogation room, and as soon as the interview began, this person openly admitted to shooting Peter Fabiano. And they would tell investigators the entire story right from the very beginning all the way up to the aftermath of the killing. And once Keeley and his partner had all these details, all the pieces began falling into place, and everything that might have confused Keeley early on now suddenly made perfect sense. Based on the killer's confession and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Peter Fabiano on the night of October 31st, 1957. At around 9 p.m. that night, the killer, wearing face makeup and baggy clothes, sat in a parked car a few houses down from Peter's, and just watched and waited. Just after 11 p.m., so after sitting in the parked car for 2 straight hours, the killer saw the bedroom lights in the Fabiano house go off. At this point, the killer slipped a mask over their face and red gloves over their hands, and then climbed out of the car and began walking toward the Fabiano's front door, carrying a brown paper bag with a .38 caliber revolver hidden inside of it. The killer rang the doorbell, and as soon as they did, they began to shake, knowing they were about to commit a crime that could land them in the gas chamber. They tried to calm their nerves by reassuring themselves that this was the perfect crime and there was no way they'd get caught. They repeated this in their head as they rang the doorbell again and called out "trick or treat" in a loud, booming, unnatural voice. Peter opened the door, looked at the killer in their ill-fitting clothes and paper mask, and laughed. "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" he asked. All the killer could think to say was no, as Peter looked down into his bucket and began fishing for candy. With Peter's attention distracted for just a moment, the killer began raising the gun, which was still concealed inside the paper bag. But as they did, their hands began to tremble violently, so they reached over with their other hand to keep themselves steady, and then continued lifting the gun with both hands. And once it was aimed squarely at Peter's chest, they fired a single shot. The bullet blew a hole through the paper bag and slammed into Peter's chest, the round settling just below his heart. Peter looked up at the killer in horror and then clutched his chest as he fell to the ground. The killer immediately turned around, cut across the yard, and ran back to the car. When they got into the passenger seat, they were shaking and on the verge of tears. They couldn't believe they had just killed a man. But the killer then felt a hand on their shoulder. They turned to the driver's seat and saw the woman they loved had a smile on her face. The woman told the killer they had done everything just right. Then she hit the gas and sped away from the neighborhood. It would turn out Peter Fabiano's killer was a woman named Goldine Pizer. She was a 42-year-old lab assistant at a children's hospital, and she had no direct connection to Peter Fabiano. In fact, she had never met him before the night she killed him. She only knew what Peter looked like because another person had driven her by the Fabiano house a week before Halloween and pointed him out. And this other person was Goldine's only connection to Peter, and this other person was the actual mastermind behind the murder. And that was Peter's former employee, Joan Rabel. It turned out that Joan and Peter's wife Betty had both lied to police about their relationship. Joan and Betty were not just friends, they were lovers. But in 1957, that was not something most people would accept, so Betty and Joan tried to hide it. However, Peter still found out about their relationship, and when he did, he was livid. He fired Joan from his salon and forbade his wife from ever seeing Joan again. But instead of submitting, Betty left her husband and went to live with Joan. However, after a couple of months with Joan, Betty realized she was better off staying with Peter and broke off her relationship with Joan. Betty moved back in with Peter and agreed to never bring up Joan's name again. And it was at this point that Joan began plotting Peter's murder. Jilted and wanting revenge, Joan began a new relationship with the very impressionable Goldine and immediately began setting her up to become Peter's assassin. Joan spoke endlessly to Goldine about what an evil and vile person Peter Fabiano was. Joan claimed Peter was cruel to his wife and cruel to his wife's children, mistreated his employees, and was essentially a monster who needed to be stopped. Over time, Goldine grew to despise Peter just through Joan's portrait of him, and that's when Joan began actively putting her plan into motion. Goldine cared so deeply for Joan, she would have done just about anything for her. And so when she walked into that Pasadena gun shop on September 21st, she felt like she was doing a heroic thing. Once the two conspirators had their plan all worked out, they decided Halloween night was the best time to carry it out, because they knew Peter would be more likely to open his door to a stranger after a steady stream of trick-or-treaters had been to his house. On the night of the murder, Joan borrowed a friend's car, leaving hers in the driveway to create the alibi, and then went to pick up Goldine at her house. Joan then drove Goldine to the Fabiano street, waited in the car until the deed was done, and drove her back home. At which point, Joan told Goldine to forget they ever knew each other and vanished from her life. Once Goldine realized she'd been used and manipulated by Joan, who didn't actually care about her, the hold that Joan had over her was broken. So when Detective Keeley got the anonymous tip and tracked Goldine down, she was more than willing to tell him everything. Joan Rabel and Goldine Pizer were both charged with first-degree murder. Both women initially pleaded not guilty, but eventually changed their pleas to guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. Joan and Goldine received sentences of 5 years to life in prison. As for Peter's widow, Betty Fabiano, she was never charged with any crime because investigators were satisfied that she had nothing to do with her husband's murder. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. On August 20th, 1989, Eric and Lyle Menendez returned home to their family's mansion in Beverly Hills and knew right away something was wrong. The driveway gate was unlocked, and then they went to their front door and it was already open. They pushed the door open and cautiously walked inside and saw there was blood on the ground and looked in their TV room, and there, slouched against the couch, was their father, Jose, and their mother, Kitty. They had both been executed. Eric and Lyle are beside themselves. They call the police and they're in total hysterics, screaming for the officers to get there, that someone's killed their parents. The police show up, they go inside, and just based on the brutality of the injuries, Jose and Kitty had clearly been gunned down with shotguns and multiple blasts because pieces of them were missing. They were just totally destroyed. The police, because of that, assumed this has got to be a mob hit. There is some real aggression here. This is not an accident, this is a statement. The police immediately turned to Jose's business. He was the CEO of this very prominent media company. He had made millions and millions of dollars. He was very well connected, and they figured that somewhere in his dealings, there must have been a bad actor that was after him. And so for the first 6 months of the investigation, the focus was almost exclusively on Jose's business contacts. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric seemed to go totally crazy. They immediately inherited the $14 million family estate, and there was this huge cash payout right up front. And so the two of them go on this insane spending spree over those first 6 months. They bought condos on the water, they bought cars and Rolexes, they bought a chicken wing shop for $550,000. I mean, they were just buying things left and right. During their parents' funeral, Lyle was overheard talking about how he can't wait to go to the US Open, and look, I just bought a new Rolex. His mind was not on the fact that his parents had just been savagely murdered. It was on, what fun thing am I going to do with my money next? After the funeral, Eric decided he was going to put his energy into becoming a professional tennis player. So for $60,000, he hires a tennis player to live at his house and work with him every day on tennis, even though realistically, Eric was not a very good tennis player. But that was his focus. That's what he was going to work on. And Lyle spent most of his time building a team of people that could help him make investments into different companies in and around New York and New Jersey. But in addition to spending tons of money on their respective career interests, the brothers were also going to therapy sessions. And during one particular closed-door session, Eric would tell his therapist that me and my brother actually killed our parents. Eric clearly believed that he was able to talk to a therapist about anything and nothing would escape this room, that it was totally confidential. But what Eric wasn't planning for is the therapist's assistant was outside the doors walking by and overheard Eric say it. And she would tell the police would confront Eric as well as Lyle, and very quickly Eric and Lyle would confess. During their confession, they told investigators that on August 18th, they went out and purchased 2 shotguns and they stored them in their home. The next day, on August 19th, the brothers and their mom and dad go out on a fishing trip together the whole day. They come back, and then on August 20th, the 2 brothers retrieve their shotguns while the parents are sitting in the TV room, and they walk in and fire 15 shots into their parents, obliterating them. Afterwards, the brothers would ditch their shotguns and bloody clothes, and they would go to the movie theater and they would watch Batman. After the movie was over, they go back to the mansion, knowing exactly what they're going to find, and they go in and they put on this big performance. Oh my goodness, someone killed our parents! But it was all a lie, because they killed their parents for their money. Eric and Lyle were given life sentences and were sent to separate prisons, but actually just recently, they were reunited in the same jail. 30 years after their crime, a guy who collected NBA trading cards was rooting through some of his older cards, and he came across the Mark Jackson 1990 card. And he noticed in the background of the picture, sitting courtside, is none other than Eric and Lyle Menendez. It was during that 6-month crazy spending spree after they had murdered their parents, when they were going around buying up whatever they wanted, and they had bought courtside tickets to that particular game, and they happened to be immortalized on this playing card.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Privilege.
On the evening of Wednesday, May 21st, 1924, a man named Jacob Franks walked up the steps to his mansion, and right as he went to open his door, his butler opened it up, welcomed him inside, and Jacob smiled at the butler and stepped in. Jacob had just spent a long day at his office in Chicago, Illinois, doing a big real estate deal, and now he was just happy to be home with his wife and his 3 kids. Jacob was an incredibly successful business person who had made a name for himself first in the early 1900s when he ran a bank that specialized in giving out these enormous loans to gamblers. But it wasn't until he was named the president of the Rockford Watch Company and he expanded into real estate that he became outrageously wealthy. His fortune in today's dollars would have been around $70 million. But now that Jacob was so well established in the business world in Chicago, he was trying to make a more conscious effort to spend more time at home with his wife and kids. And so as soon as he walked past his butler into his mansion, he hung up his hat and his jacket, and he went to find his wife, Flora, to tell her about an idea he had for a trip for that upcoming weekend. But when Jacob found Flora, she was not remotely interested in talking about their weekend plans, because Flora was very worked up about their youngest son, Bobby. Bobby, who was 14 years old, was supposed to come home right after school, but it was now 6 p.m. and he still hadn't shown up, and she had no idea where he was. And Jacob's reaction to this news was just to feel kind of aggravated. Bobby was generally a really good kid. He was a student at a prestigious boys' school right down the road, and his teacher was convinced that Bobby was the smartest kid in his entire grade. Bobby was a member of the school's debate team and regularly beat the older kids, and Bobby was just a natural leader and very hardworking and kind. But Bobby could also be fairly irresponsible sometimes, specifically in terms of coming home on time. This was not the first time that Bobby had not come home by curfew. So Jacob told Flora, don't worry about it. This is something Bobby does. He likely lost track of time. And as Jacob and Flora are having this discussion, Bobby's older brother came into the room and suggested to his dad, Jacob, that perhaps Bobby was across the street at Richard's house. Richard was Bobby's cousin, playing tennis on their private court. Richard and Bobby were quite close, even though they were 4 years apart. Richard was 18, Bobby was 14, but they really bonded over tennis. And so that was something they did all the time. And so Jacob said he would go across the street and see if Bobby was there, and he also told his wife, Flora, to just continue to call around town and see if anybody knew where Bobby might be. And so Jacob left his mansion and began walking across the street towards Richard's family's mansion to see if his son was there. Now, this neighborhood that Jacob lived in was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods really in the entire country, but definitely within Chicago's city limits. It was called South Kenwood, and basically imagine a street where every house is a huge mansion, and every mansion is home to some business tycoon or famous person, and all the families who lived in this neighborhood had a full staff of maids and butlers and drivers and fleets of private cars. I mean, these people who lived in South Kenwood were literally the richest of the rich. And so Jacob, he gets across the street, he's standing in front of Richard's family's mansion, and he looks around the side, and he can see the private tennis court where his son and Richard would always play, but it's totally vacant, and in fact, the house is just totally quiet. No one's home. When Jacob got back to his own home, he found his wife pacing around in the parlor looking really concerned, and so Jacob immediately asked her, what'd you learn? What's going on? And she would tell Jacob that she had spoken to one of Bobby's friends who told her that Bobby had umpired a baseball game after school and had left to walk back home at around 5 p.m. The school and the baseball field where Bobby would have been was only about 3 blocks away from their home. And now it was 6:30 p.m. So it's been an hour and a half since Bobby had supposedly began his walk home. And so by now he certainly should be here, but of course he wasn't. At this point, Jacob went from feeling aggravated with his son to being concerned for his son's safety, despite the fact that he's thinking, okay, well, my son is likely somewhere in this neighborhood in South Kenwood, one of the safest, richest, best places in the country. He's got to be okay, but I really want to find him. And so Jacob would call one of his very close friends who lived in this neighborhood, who also happened to be a former state senator, and he asked him to come over and basically look around the neighborhood for Bobby. When the state senator friend arrived at Jacob's house, the two men left and began walking down the street lined with mansions, making their way towards the school where Bobby supposedly had been umpiring. And when they got there, they saw there was no baseball game happening, and the school was dark and closed for the night. But Jacob and his friend decided that, maybe it was possible that after umpiring this game, when Bobby had begun his walk home, maybe he had taken a detour into the school to get something, and then perhaps the doors got shut and locked on him. And so Jacob and his friend went to the school and looked for a way to basically break into the school. And sure enough, they would find an open window, they'd open it up, they would climb inside, and they would search the entire school, but Bobby was not in there. At this point, Jacob was really starting to panic. His friend was trying to calm him down, but Jacob is now thinking, something is terribly wrong with my son. And so the two men actually ran from the school back to Jacob's house, and when they went inside, Jacob immediately called out to his wife to see if maybe she had located Bobby, but when he called Flora's name, there was no response. And so Jacob and his friend, they run inside and they make their way towards the parlor, which is where they had last seen Flora before they left. And when they walked in there, they found Flora lying on the ground, totally lifeless, with the phone off the hook right next to her hand. And so Jacob and the senator, they run over and they begin shaking Flora, and suddenly she wakes up with a gasp, and she looks up at Jacob and just begins sobbing hysterically. And after Jacob finally calmed her down, she would tell him that after they had left to go to the school, she had received a phone call. And at first, she thought it was Bobby calling to check in. But when she answered it, it wasn't Bobby, it was a man's voice she didn't recognize, who told her that Bobby had been kidnapped. He was safe for now, but if they went to police, something terrible would happen to him. This mystery man also told Flora that they would be in touch soon with more information, and then they hung up. And Flora had been so overwhelmed by what she was told that she had fainted, and that was why they found her on the ground. That night, Jacob, Flora, and the state senator friend stayed up late going over, what they should do. Of course, they wanted to go to police, but this felt like a credible threat that Bobby could be harmed if they did that. And so they just went back and forth over how to handle this horrible situation. But by 2 a.m., they had made a decision. The state senator had some close friends and connections in the police department, and so they decided that they would go talk to the police, but they would swear them to secrecy so the kidnapper or kidnappers wouldn't know the police were investigating. And so, a few hours later, when the police department opened up, Jacob and the state senator friend went to the police, they spoke to the highest ranking officer who was sworn to secrecy, and then that morning, the police would begin a quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping. At the same time this investigation was beginning, on the morning of May 22nd, 1924, a man named Morton D. Ballard drove through downtown Chicago in a luxury car known as a Willis Knight. He pulled this luxury car into a parking lot right next to a rental car company, and after parking the car, Morton got out, he went inside of the shop, and he handed the keys over to the clerk behind the desk. The clerk would ask Morton, how did it go with your rental car? And Morton would say, oh, it was perfect, went totally fine. After that, Morton thanked the clerk, he turned around and walked outside where another luxury car was waiting for him, being driven by his good friend, Lewis Mason. And once Morton had climbed inside, the two men smiled and drove off and disappeared into traffic. That same morning, Jacob and Flora received a letter from the kidnapper or kidnappers demanding $10,000 in small unmarked bills, and if they gave this money over, they would get their son back. And immediately, Jacob went to the bank and got the money, but before he could actually deliver the money to the kidnappers at the location they had specified in this letter, the police, who were quietly investigating, discovered a clue that would break the case wide open. It would take over a week to unravel this bizarre clue, but it all started to come together when the police brought in Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason for questioning. Here is the shocking story that detectives were finally able to piece together about what happened to Bobby Franks. On May 7th, 1924, so 2 weeks before Bobby went missing, Morton D. Ballard walked into a hotel in Chicago called the Morrison and rented room 1031. He would tell the front desk that he wanted them to hold his mail for him, and over the next couple of days, Morton would come in and he would get his mail from the front desk, but he didn't appear to ever actually go up to his room. Finally, a suspicious maid at the Morrison Hotel, who had been going into room 1031 every day to clean it, only to discover that Morton was not in there and the room was totally untouched and clean already, she went in one morning and saw Morton was not in there, and she would actually just open up one of Morton's suitcases that he had left inside. And instead of the suitcase containing clothes or toiletries, it just contained a bunch of random library books. As it happened, after this maid found this strange suitcase full of books, Morton stopped coming to the hotel. He stopped getting his mail, he did not claim his luggage, and he didn't pay the bill. He just kind of vanished. On May 9th, so just a couple of days after Morton first booked that room at the Morrison Hotel, Morton also opened a bank account in Chicago. He also made his first appearance at that car rental company where he asked for the Willis Knight car. The rental company would not just let anybody take a Willis Knight car. You needed a reference to show that you were someone who could pay for this type of vehicle, and so Morton's friend, Lewis Mason, would give him that reference and allow him to rent the Willis Knight car. About a week and a half later, on May 21st, so the day Bobby went missing, Morton and Lewis were driving around South Kenwood in their Willis Knight car when they spotted Bobby by himself walking down the road. Now, Lewis recognized Bobby, and he knew that Bobby was an incredible tennis player, and Lewis had a question for Bobby about a particular tennis racket. And so Lewis, who was in the front seat of the car, told Morton, who was driving, to pull over so Lewis could talk to Bobby. And so Morton pulled over, Lewis rolled his window down, he called over to Bobby, Bobby came over, and before long, Lewis and Bobby were talking about this tennis racket, and then when that conversation naturally wrapped up, Lewis offered Bobby a ride the rest of the way home, because that was where Bobby was walking to when they stopped him. And so Lewis climbed into the back seat, Morton stayed in the driver's seat, and Bobby climbed inside and sat in the front seat. And then once those two were situated, Morton pulled away from the curb and began driving towards Bobby's house. And as they were driving to Bobby's house, Bobby just kind of continued talking about this tennis racket because that was the thing they were talking about. And as he was mid-sentence, Lewis from the back seat reached into his pocket, pulled out a chisel, and then lunged forward and began smashing Bobby in the back of the head over and over again with this chisel. And as Bobby is screaming in pain and trying to protect himself, Lewis lunges forward, grabs Bobby, drags him into the backseat, and then holds him down, pulls a rag out of his pocket, and jams it into Bobby's throat. And then he closes Bobby's mouth and holds it shut until Bobby goes still. After that, Lewis kind of grimaced at all of Bobby's blood all over him, and he kind of pushed Bobby down onto the floorboards below, and then Lewis calmly climbed back into the front seat and sat down, and meanwhile, Morton has not remotely reacted to what's just happened. This is just business as usual. Morton and Lewis did not go to Bobby's house, but instead drove towards Indiana. And on their drive to Indiana, they would stop at a roadside restaurant and eat hot dogs and root beers with their car parked right near this restaurant with Bobby's body just totally exposed laying out on the floorboards of the back seat. Morton and Lewis would eventually get into Indiana, and they would head to this particular forest that Morton was familiar with because he was a bird watcher and often came out here. And when they got to this forest, they parked in this clearing. They got out, they checked on Bobby and confirmed that he was dead, so they pulled him out, they stripped all of his clothes off of him, they rolled him up in a rug, and then they dragged him over to this drainage pipe that sat underneath some railroad tracks in this swampy area, and they jammed him inside of it. And then they got back in their car, they drove back to Chicago, at which point Morton called Bobby's mother, Flora, and informed her that her son was kidnapped, but alive, even though he wasn't, and don't call the police, we'll be in touch soon. That night, Morton and Lewis would burn all of the clothes they had stripped off of Bobby. They would also clean the interior of their Willis Knight rental car, and then they would play a game of cards together before going to bed. The next day, May 22nd, so the same day that police began their quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping, Morton and Lewis would send that letter to Jacob and Flora demanding $10,000 for the safe return of Bobby. But unfortunately, before Lewis and Morton could claim their ransom money, Bobby's body was discovered. In fact, that day he was discovered. A walker was cutting through the woods in Indiana and saw Bobby in the pipe. And so when Morton and Lewis realized that, the jig is up, the family's never going to pay for their son because he's dead, they just returned their Willis Knight rental car and went back to their normal lives as if nothing had ever happened. But unbeknownst to him, Morton had accidentally dropped his eyeglasses right next to Bobby's body when they dumped him in the woods in Indiana. And Morton's eyeglasses were very unique. In fact, there was only one store in the world that sold this particular kind of eyeglasses. And so when detectives got the call about Bobby's body being found, they would also find these glasses. And that was the big clue, because these glasses led detectives to the store where they were sold, and the owner of the store was able to say that, yep, those particular glasses were sold to Morton. And when detectives went to Morton, Morton immediately pointed the finger at Lewis, saying that Morton didn't do anything to Bobby, Lewis did. But about a week later, on May 31st, both Morton and Lewis would confess to police that they murdered Bobby. But far more shocking than what Morton and Lewis had done was who they were, because Morton and Lewis were not their real names. The two men who killed Bobby Franks were rich kids just like Bobby who lived in South Kenwood. They created two fake names, Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason, and then they booked room 1031 at the Morrison Hotel. Now, they had no intention of actually staying at this hotel, and so they just left that suitcase full of books inside of the room to make it appear like they were staying there. But in reality, the only reason they booked that room is they needed a physical mailing address that was connected to their fake personas. And so after booking this room, they began sending mail to Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason at the Morrison Hotel, room 1031. And then after collecting that mail, which served as a sort of proof of legal name and address, they were able to open a bank account in Chicago. They dumped some money into that. And then again, they used their proof of legal name and address to rent that Willis Knight car, and then used money from their phony bank account to pay for it. And then once they had their luxury car, it was time to go kill. In reality, Morton was actually a 19-year-old prodigy named Nathan Leopold. He spoke 5 languages, he had already graduated from college, and he was a nationally respected ornithologist, which is someone who studies birds. Nathan's IQ was so high, it literally couldn't be measured. His father was the president of a very successful steamship company, and Nathan was planning to attend Harvard University in the fall to get yet another college degree. And Lewis was actually 18-year-old Richard Loeb, who was Bobby's cousin and one of his best friends. Bobby and Richard played tennis together all the time in Richard's private court, which is where Bobby's father went first to go looking for his son. Like Nathan, Richard was also a genius. He was the youngest person ever to have graduated from the University of Michigan. He graduated at 17 years old. And to celebrate the occasion, Richard's father, who in today's dollars was worth about $175 million, he was a retired vice president for the major retail store Sears, he bought Richard a custom golf course. He built him his own golf course. That was his graduation present. And at the time of Bobby's murder, Richard was actually enrolled at the University of Chicago's law school, studying to become a lawyer. Nathan and Richard would very proudly tell investigators that they didn't kill Bobby to get money out of his parents. Nathan and Richard were fabulously wealthy. The money meant nothing. Instead, they had come up with this scheme and killed Bobby because of their belief in the philosopher Nietzsche's concept of supermen. Men whose superiority allows them to rise above all ordinary rules, ethics, and laws. Basically, Nathan and Richard believed they were so much better than everybody else in the world that if they wanted to kill someone, they should be able to. And Bobby seemed like a pretty easy target. After Nathan and Richard confessed, they were put under arrest, but a chauffeur was allowed to come to the police station and drop off silk pajamas for them to wear in custody, and instead of being held in a cell, they were allowed to stay in a hotel. But ultimately, they both were sentenced to life in prison. Bobby's family never recovered from his murder, and his father, Jacob, would die just 4 years after his son died. As for Nathan, he would be murdered in prison in 1936 by another inmate. And as for Richard, he would serve his time and get paroled and then die of natural causes in 1971. Today, the murder of Bobby Franks is often referred to as the crime of the century.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen's Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just